Welcome to The Teaching Curve, a podcast exploring the pedagogy of global politics and international relations, produced under the auspices of the innovative Pedagogy initiative of the International Studies Association, and made available through the ISA Professional Resource Center. I'm Jamie Free, Associate Provost and Professor of Global Politics at Bridgewater College. Each episode of The Teaching Curve is a conversation with a thoughtful and engaged teacher of global politics. The goal is to celebrate and inspire pedagogical creativity by taking a pause from what are, almost by default these days, hectic lives, to think deeply about the role each of us plays in building and rebuilding the identities that define us as professionals. Without a periodic poke to draw our attention to these contextual issues, it is all too easy to skate by year after year, relying on pat answers and established patterns of social power to tell us who we are and what we should be doing as teachers. Today's conversation is with Dr. Naeem Inayatullah, Professor of Politics at Ithaca College in New York in the United States. Naeem has invested the time to think through some of these foundational issues and to reimagine his classroom environments in ways that might make learning more likely. He has laid out what amounts to a challenge for all instructors of global politics in a 2022 book from Rowman Littlefield, Pedagogy as Encounter, Beyond the Teaching Imperative. Our conversation is an introduction to that challenge, exploring the value of the concept of teaching as a definition of the relationships that we have with our students. Our often unquestioned assumptions about students that determine so much about how we frame what we and they are up to. And whether teaching global politics, or any field of study, can ultimately change the world, and why we should devote ourselves to the project, even if the answer is no. Naeem Inayatullah, thank you very much for being here. It's a great honor to have you on here.
Thank you for the invitation, Jamie, and likewise, it's an honor for me. It's always a good conversation with you.
Let's begin with a little bit about your context and where you're teaching so everybody can kind of frame that. And the way I like to do that is to have people explain a little bit about the students that are at your institution.
Yeah, I'm at Ithaca College and have been since 1996. Before that, I was at Syracuse for 8 years, and before that, I was at Colorado for 2 years. So big schools, and then Ithaca College is a smaller school. It's not a liberal arts college per se. It's got some strange comprehensive something.
Yep.
It's about 5,000 or 6,000 students, depends on the year. And we basically do only undergraduate students. And the undergraduates that come here are fun to work with because I like to say that you can distract them into learning something. So I like my students here a lot. They're easy to hang out with.
You've spent a lot of time thinking about how best to reach them and how to build environments in which they're most likely to learn things. Some of that's come out in this book, which is just this year, summarizing a lot of thoughts. I know you and I have had conversations, and I've read a lot of stuff about how you think about it, and pulling this all together into one treatise, I think helps a lot. Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
It's emerged almost out of that article that I wrote in your book, where I have a footnote that says, this is a short version. A much longer version would take a book about 45,000 words, and this is that book.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a sabbatical some years back, and all I had was a list of anecdotes that I wanted to tell. And then about 1 month before getting back to classes, I sat down and started writing. And it just flowed out of me. The first draft only took 3 weeks. So the stories were there. I'd been thinking about them for a long time, and I kind of let the writing do its work. And so it was a lot of fun. It was about 8 to 10 hours a day for 3 weeks. And my wife was quite amazed that I could put out a draft that quickly.
I think the rest of us are too. That's wonderful.
Well, it's only happened twice in my life, once on a paper and once in this particular book. So, I think the trick is to get yourself saturated. And when you're nice and saturated, then it just comes out of you.
So when I first started doing this, and this list has evolved, but I have a list of questions that I have that I think, okay, well, these are things that I would want to ask. But there's one question on the list that was inspired by you and your approach to teaching, and that I've never asked to anybody else. There's all these questions. So here's the question. What does it mean to teach?
Yeah, boy, that, Jamie, that's a really difficult question given the situation I'm in with this book, because my polemical claim is that teaching is not really possible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if I stick with that premise, then teaching is a hopeless act of, I mean, it's a desperate act to try and get somebody to do something that you want them to do. So it's not that different from other acts of power. So I think teaching that's on the one hand. I mean, that's how I see it. But on the other hand, we all, sit or stand or walk around in the classroom, and what we think we're doing in there, I know we call it teaching, but part of the project of this book is to look at that action where the professor's in the room with a bunch of students, and to really ask ourselves, well, what's actually going on there? We call it teaching, but what's actually going on in there, right? So I've tried to think about this in terms of music. Yeah, you go to a concert and there's musical information coming at you, but that's not a concert. That there's energy exchanges going on, but that's not a concert. Something else is actually happening between the musicians, the music, and the audience. Something is happening in that concert. So I think the classroom is a similar setting. We call it teaching, just like we call a concert, but we don't actually pay attention to what is happening in that context, in those moments. And so in some ways, now having presented the book a few times, the question that's really emerged in my head is, what's happening there? And the problem with us as professors, I think almost all of us as professors, is that we take that drama for granted and don't ask ourselves, all right, so how, now switch metaphors again, from music to drama. If it's a musical event, if it's a dramatic event, if it's a teaching event, what's actually happening in the classroom? And if we started to pay attention to that with the kind of finesse and energy and devotion that we do to our research, wow, I think things would change rather dramatically. The reason this book emerged is because I realized that most of my teaching was failed teaching. And, this is like 34th or 35th year of my teaching. And basically the thing I try to teach is global inequality. What is the nature of global inequality? Mm-hmm. And it's only been in the last few years that a few of my students here have taken me up on that. But prior to that, and no matter what institution I was in, even though as I say in the book, I got decent evaluations, I got good evaluations, and yet I was totally convinced that I was not able to have them learn anything about what I was teaching. So once I realized that what I was teaching was not what they were there for, not what they were learning, then I began to think, okay, why am I failing all the time? Why am I failing to get these points across all the time? And yet they seem to be enjoying the experience. Mm-hmm. So it's that conundrum that really got me going on. All right, let me try and figure out what exactly is going on in this space.
Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, the book argues you've got some insights now into how we can create environments in which we get the answers that you were looking for even from the very beginning.
Yeah. So the way it worked out was that I considered that course in a way a failure. It was my first failure because I had no idea at that point that it wasn't about my yellow notepads and my hours and hours spent on getting the lectures right. And, it was none of that. Something else was going on in that space. And so that started the process over the decades of trying to figure out, all right, what exactly is happening in this space? And how do I get it? How do I think about this space, the relationship between the topography of the classroom, my presence in it, my students' presence in it, the text, the syllabus, all of that. How do I think of that now as something that I can potentially redesign? And so I started redesigning that space in all the different ways that I mentioned, including the geometry of the classroom, and kept thinking, no, I'm not getting there. 10 years later, I'm thinking to myself, this is, evaluations, yes, good, but this is not happening. And finally giving up on the idea. Okay, I know that what I want to happen in this classroom is not happening.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm going to try and figure out what it is that the space is good for. Is it good for anything? And if it's good for something, how do I adapt my geometry, the style, the presence, the assumptions, so that something can come out of this space, even though it's not about teaching and not necessarily even about learning, something else is happening in that room.
Mm-hmm.
How can it's like, you know, to go back to the concert metaphor just for a second, you know, you can design a really good sonic space that not only lets the music be heard very clearly, but where everybody gets to see each other's faces and sees each other enjoying the music, and that there's a rapport between the audience and the musicians, so that the energy flows very freely. All right, so how do you design a concert space and a concert event that allows that kind of intimacy and also intensity? And so this is the kind of question I started to pose for myself. Well, what can I do? One, now that I've given up on the process of teaching, what is left in here for me to still do?
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the other members of that interaction where you're trying to get that to happen. How do you help the students find, in a metacognitive way, how do you help them find how they can get the most out of that experience?
Yeah, that's still the, 36 years later, that's still the question. Yeah, well, I'll give you a really simple answer. I mean, it's, it takes practice to put this into effect, but I'll give you a simple answer just to give you a simple answer. I walk in with two assumptions in my relationship with a student. One is, I don't know if these assumptions are true, okay, but they're good working assumptions, all right? So one is, the student has a project. They don't know, they may not know they have a project, but they have a project. And the student's real desire is the unfolding of that project, almost to infinity. Like we might call it an intrinsic curiosity. All right. So assumption number one, each one of my students has a unique individual project which can unfold infinitely. Yeah. That's one assumption. Very generous assumption.
Fair enough.
Second assumption, that every student will find a way to block that project. Right. So it's not necessarily just that it's a macro sociological block, although it might be. Many of them don't make it to school. They're under financial difficulties. They're not eating enough. They're partying, whatever. But I'm going to waive all that because the real block is internal. Yeah. So the second assumption is that they block their own curiosity. Right. So on the first assumption, infinite curiosity. That each unique infinite curiosity of each individual student. Second assumption, they find not one, not two, many ways to block their own curiosity. All right. So that creates the essential tension for me in the classroom. When I walk into a classroom now, I don't have those notes. I'm thinking, okay, these two assumptions about every individual in the room are probably going to be true. Let me find out what the curiosity is about and what the blocks are. Yeah? And so then my job becomes really simple in the classroom is, well, it's simple. It's not that simple, but the idea is simple. How do I get the student to see these two things? First, I got to find out what they are. So project number one, get to know the student well enough to be able to see these two things, the individual project and the blocking. And then second, how do I present the potential insight that I have about their how they block their own curiosity to them. Yeah. Now it can't be a one-way thing. I can't think to myself, oh, I know this person, because that's just back to teaching in the form of psychotherapy. But so the idea is to how to engage them in a conversation so that they can respond to my hypotheses about how they're blocking their own curiosity and why they need to block their own curiosity, and if these are the methods. So if I engage them in a long-term conversation, whether it's text, whether it's conversation in classrooms, whether it's in office hours, whether it's over 3 or 4 different courses, if I can engage them in this long-term conversation, then the project becomes my suggestion to them at some point. Look, here are the ways that I think That's key. It may not be true. Here are the ways in which I think you're blocking your own curiosity. What do you think of what I just said? So this becomes the project.
So,
really far away from bundles and bundles of notes and lectures.
for sure. I mean, but it's an empathetic investment in the relationship and the interactions with you with another individual.
Yeah.
And a bunch of individuals in the class, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the things that, for those people who love teaching, I think that's an articulation of what they love about. Now, there's some people who love being found to be wise, right? They get to stand up and they get to reflect in the sense that they get to have that power of the knowledge being spread. And that. But I think that the people who genuinely say, what I love about teaching is the students, that's getting at what they mean, I think.
I couldn't have put it better. So part of what would be, so if the student doesn't know what's happening in the classroom and the professor is unable to articulate it, then probably what's going on, if my book has got anything to say about these things, is the encounter is enriching somehow.
Mm-hmm.
The encounter is enriching somehow for both parties. So now, if that assumption is true, then the question becomes, all right, what makes enriching encounters? What makes encounters that are enriching? How does that happen?
Yep, exactly. And in some ways, what you're also hoping is that the students uncover that project in a way that they own it more than they have in the past, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. That's also, we should teach together to see how this works for the two of us. I try to tell them at the end of every course a little bit about the experience that they've had, and one of the things I say to them, the very last thing I say to them before we part company, is I say, you've experienced what it means to be part of a learning community. You've experienced what it means to enter or create a learning community. And now you know how to do it, which makes me obsolete in your life. Yeah. Now that you know how to be in a learning community, now you know how to enter one and how to create one. You can do this. You can do this on your own. If I can do it, anybody can. So that is a really important part for me, is to get them to think, okay, this is a replicable experience, and I have some knowledge already about how to do it because I've just experienced this for the last 15 weeks.
Right. And well, I have a hypothesis that that the subject matter of global politics is actually a very good medium for getting at this kind of self-realization and the embracing of the project, that there's pieces of it that may be different from how people encounter other subject matters, other disciplines at the university, at the college.
No, I think that's, I want to endorse that hypothesis, Jamie.
Excellent.
Because our field is also about encounters, just at a different scale.
Exactly. I mean, that's why I found worth and value in this career, is because I'm hoping that what we can get is students to embrace that idea of encounters with difference and making those more productive and more fun.
Yes. Yeah. Fun and intense. And I'm gonna guess here at a fundamental difference between your approach and my approach. I mean, we've had many conversations. So, and this is just one of my wild guesses, right? So I think there is no hope for our discipline in making a positive contribution to the world. Not just international relations, but any discipline, anthropology, political science, economics. There's no hope for that, because one of my premises is the academy is structurally designed to be an apologist for empire. Yeah. So As individuals, we might like to think that we're making a difference, and perhaps we are making the difference in the case of one or two people that we've had encounters with. But on the whole, that still leaves the rest of a professor here or there is not going to make a difference to the way that the academy is structured. So I've given up on the idea that we can do that we're heroes, that we are going to make a positive contribution. No, basically our field explains and apologizes for empire.
And not just the field, right, but the idea of how education is framed.
Yeah, the academy. Yeah,
the academy, right.
And not just, K through 12 also.
Yeah, it's true. I think that there's ways in which the environments, the classroom environments, and the course systems that you're implementing give people at least a chance to question that, right? And to say, this education that I've gotten to this point seems directed in this way. And, if I'm just interested in getting the grades right, I've bought into that system and following what they ask me to do. And this is a different kind of project for the class.
Yeah. On the one hand, the project that I think I'm engaged in is much more modest, but also more selfish. In essence, the encounter, the question you might ask, or that I might ask, is, all right, suppose you're right, all that happens is really about encounter in the classroom with the students. What's in it for the professor in that? Yeah. And the answer is, I've given up on trying to do good. I've given up on all that. Given up on teaching and learning. So what is it? Well, it's a window. The student is a micro instantiation of macro structures in the world. And if you can get them to trust you and share their story with you, they let you see through their world what the world that they occupy looks like. Yeah. And so if on the one hand I give up on everything else, then I'm still holding on to this particular idea that it's worth getting. These encounters with students are worth it because they help us to create an accurate picture of the world, a better picture of the world. What that picture, what that knowledge amounts to, I don't know. But what I feel confident in saying is that over the last 30 years, getting to know these students' lives, I could never have imagined how fragile and how rich, simultaneously fragile, and how rich their lives are. If you're standing in a stage that's 3 feet high and the students are below you and you're lecturing, you're never going to learn the delicacy of life that your students experience. So that's still what's in it for me, is that there's a richness there that they bring with them.
Naeem Inayatullah, thank you very much for being part of this. It is a pleasure always to talk to you about teaching, even if
I feel the same way about talking to you about just about anything, Jamie.
Well, that's great, and hopefully we'll get the chance to do that in Montreal. You're going to
Montreal, inshallah.
Indeed. Okay, great. Thank you very much, and I know that this is going to be very thought-provoking for everybody in the audience, and that's a gift. Thank you.
My pleasure.
To participate in more conversations about these issues, I hope you'll join us for ISA's Innovative Pedagogy Conference, to be held Tuesday, March 14th, 2023, the day before the main conference begins in Montreal. You can find out about the list of workshops and register for the conference on ISA's website. The Teaching Curve podcast is made available in the ISA Professional Resources Center under the auspices of the Innovative Pedagogy Initiative. You can send feedback or suggestions for future interviews to teachingcurve@isanet.org, and you should follow us on Twitter @teachingcurve. Thank you for joining us again on the Teaching Curve, and remember, learn something every time you teach.